In this section of the course, we want to talk about the so-called copy options. So a copy option is basically just modifying the behavior of our copy into command, which is probably the most important command that we need to talk about, this copy command. And with these copy options, we can just add this option as basically a property of the copy into command. So we can modify the behavior. And the syntax is very simple. So we have already seen this is how our copy into command can be structured, and then just in the end we can specify the given copy option. So we can just specify the copy option that we want to modify, for example on error, and then we can just set it to another value. So you can see the syntax is very straightforward, and this is the basic way of how this works. And therefore in the next lectures we now want to dive a little bit deeper into the different copy options that we have available and that we should know about. And that's what we are doing in the next lectures. So now let's talk about the first option we can add after our copy command, and that is the validation mode. So like this, we can have a validation instead of loading our data. So maybe we only want to verify and validate how this copy command would work and if we would encounter any errors. So if we add validation mode and then specify return errors, then no data would be loaded and it would be just validated if there are any errors, and then also the list of errors would be returned. We have here another option that is called return n rows. So like this, we can specify the number of rows that should be returned if there are no errors. So for example, we can add here the number 10, and then the first 10 rows would be returned if there are no errors. But still, this would not be loaded into our table, but it would be just returned. And if there are any errors in these first 10 rows, then this error would be returned. So these are the two main options we have here for this validation mode. So this is pretty simple, and therefore let's quickly have a look at how this works in practice. For this, we want to create a new worksheet just out of convenience, and we can call this validation mode. And in here we can now again paste all of the code that you also find, of course, in the resources of this lecture, so that you can work along with me. What we want to do now is, first, we want to create a new database that we will work on in this lecture. So this is a very simple command we already know. Afterwards, we also want to create an orders table. So these are the columns that we want to use. So it's a little bit different than before, but it's also, again, something we already know, something very simple. And after that, we want to create a new stage object. This stage object is again a publicly available S3 bucket, so we don't need to have any credentials, and the URL of that is just visible in here. So let's also execute this and create our additional stage object called AWS stage copy. Let's have a look at what files are in this S3 bucket in our stage. For that, we want to execute the command list, then add, and then our stage object name. Let's execute it, and what we can see is that there are, in this case, 2 files in this S3 bucket. So that's what we want to load now. And for this, we of course use our copy command. So we use copy into the table that we have just created. And then also from that stage, of course, we remember we need to use that @ sign. And we can note that the context is already set to the database, so copy db and public. We can verify that this is where our stage object is also residing in. So we have, if we just refresh all of the objects, copy db, and now we should see in the public schema our stage. So this is where our stage lives, and therefore we can just call it like this, because this is the context which we have set. Afterwards, we have the file format. We have just a CSV file, comma, and we skip the header. And then we want to load all of those two files. What we can do is just use the pattern with these wildcards. And then we use the validation mode, return errors. So this should now return all of the errors if there are any errors encountered. And if there are no errors at all, then we don't get any rows returned. And note, no data will be loaded if we use this validation mode, return errors. Let's execute it and have a look at the output. We can see, first of all, again, no active warehouse selected. So let's just select it. And then once we have selected it, we can execute the code again. So that's just something we have to be aware of. And we can see there is no row returned. This means that all of the data is okay to be loaded. There were no errors when we tried to load it. But of course, nothing has been loaded yet. So we can also verify that. If we want, we can select from the table. So for example, we can just say select star from, and now we can just use orders because we are currently anyways in the correct database and the correct schema. So let's execute it. We see the table exists, but there is no data included. And now what we can also do is use return and then the number of rows that should be validated. So let's quickly execute it and have a look. We can see that if we do this, we see the first 5 rows. This means that there have not been any errors in the first 5 rows. So all of that has been validated, these first 5 rows, and as we can see them and we have them returned, we know that there are no errors in these first 5 rows, and we can see that data. Of course, still no data has been loaded into our orders table. But now let's have a look at what happens if there are indeed some errors in our stage. Let's do this. We want to create a new stage, and now there are indeed some errors in these files. So first of all, let's replace our stage object to point to a new bucket. And also let's quickly have a look at what files are contained in this bucket. We see that in this case, now we have 4 files, and actually 2 of them contain errors. So let's quickly see what happens if we load, or if we try to load all of these files with, of course, the validation mode set to return errors. So what we expect now is to see all of the errors that occur in all of these files. And of course, nothing will be loaded because we use this validation mode, return errors. So let's quickly execute it, and we see this doesn't work at the moment because we have forgotten to use this semicolon, which is always indicating the end of the command, and this can sometimes lead to an error. So we can see copy into, there's supposed to be an error in here, and this is just coming from because this was not interpreted as the end of this command, and this can lead to an error. So this can happen sometimes. Let's also now try to execute it again with the semicolon, and now we see all of the errors that have occurred in all of these files that we were trying to load. So first of all, we see numeric value was not recognized. This is in the first file. And then also in this other file, we see that there are 2 values or 2 errors that caused problems. So important, we see the error message, we see the file in which this has occurred, and then also in which line of this file this has occurred. And then also we see exactly the character where this has occurred, and also what is the category of error. So in here it is a conversion problem. This is what we have as information, which can be very valuable if we want to determine what is wrong with this file. Now let's also have a look at return n rows. So we want to see what happens if there are any mistakes, and we use the n row method. So let's again validate this. We execute it, and now we see in these first files apparently there was no error. And this is now a bit surprising because we have actually seen some errors. But in this case, we have just loaded or validated the files that had no errors. So if we have a look at this list, let's execute it again. We will see that there are also these files with no errors. And now if we just add something in the pattern, so we can see that there are some errors. So let's, for example, use or search with the pattern error. Then we should see that now if there are some errors, we should not be able to see the returning rows, but we should see the first occurring error message. Let's try to do it again. We copy it and we see that this is the error message. And even if we now modify it to, let's say, 1 or 2, this will not work. We will get the error message. This is because the error occurs already in the first row. So let's try to do this again. And we see again, this is not recognized. So this is how we can validate our copy commands to see if everything would work without actually loading the data.